Hello Math 140 students, this is your instructor Cindy Enrique, and we will be going over section 10.1, the square root principle and completing the square. So if x squared is equal to a, where a is a real number, then x is equal to the square root of a or the negative square root of a. So it's common to indicate the positive and negative solutions by writing plus or minus the square root of a. So for example, here we have x squared is equal to 40. So in order to solve for this, we are going to do the square root, and we're going to make sure that we don't forget the plus or minus. So the square root and the x squared cancel out. So don't forget that on the opposite side, we need the plus or minus. So we are left with x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 40. And if you were to plug that into your calculator, the square root of 40 is really just going to be plus or minus 2 square root 10. Okay? And if you're like, wait, how did she get that? Well, one, I did this on my calculator, but if you wanted to do it by hand, if I have 40 and I break that down, that's 10 times 4, which is 2 times 5, 2 times 2. So 40 can really be written as 2 squared times 2 times 5. So inside the square root, I have 2 squared times 2 times 5. So the square root, since that's a 2, means that this can come out and everything else stays inside. So that's how I get that 2 square root 10. Just in case you wanted to see how square root 40 turned into 2 square root 10. But again, this can be done on your calculator. I just plug it in and that's going to be my answer. So for the next one, I have the same process where I'm going to have my x squared is equal to a negative 9. So to undo the square, I square root it, and I can't forget the plus or minus. So I'm going to have the x is equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 9. But if you plug in the square root of negative 9, you're going to get that it's not a real solution. You're going to get error on your calculator. So because it's negative, inside the square root, then we say that it's going to be a non-real solution. Later on, we're going to see that there is going to be an answer, but the answer is going to be imaginary. So it's going to happen with an I, but we're not there yet. So for now, we just say it's a non-real solution. Okay, so for number 3, I can't do the square root yet until I get the square isolated. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I can get that x squared is equal to, well, 100 minus 2 is 98. And then from here, this is where I do the square root on both sides. So I'm left with x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 98. And the square root of 98, and again, you can either break it down or plug it into your calculator, but it's going to break down to 7 square root 2 as your final answer. Okay. So for number 4, I can see that I have x plus 6, all within my parentheses squared is equal to 49. So again, I am going to go ahead and do that square root to get rid of it. Don't forget the plus or minus. So I'm going to have that x plus 6 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 49. But the square root of 49 is really just 7, because 7 times 7 is 49. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 6 from both sides. And remember, that negative 6 has to go in front of the plus or minus. So I'm going to have that x is equal to negative 6 plus or minus 7. So I'm going to have two answers here. X is equal to negative 6 plus 7. So x is going to equal, well, negative 6 plus 7 is a positive 1. And my second answer here, I'm going to have x is equal to a negative 6 minus 7. So that plus or minus literally means one problem is going to be addition, and that second problem is going to be subtraction. So now I have negative 6 minus 7, so I'm going to get that x is equal to a negative 13 as my final answer. So I have two distinct answers because I had two distinct problems, that plus and the minus. Okay, so then from here we have some practice problems. So hopefully you guys are getting used to that notation. So I have x squared is equal to 144. So I'm going to have my square root, and I can't forget the plus or minus. So that x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 144, and the square root of 144 is equal to 12. So x is equal to plus or minus 12. So you can either leave it as x is equal to plus or minus 12, or you can write it as x is equal to 12 and negative 12. Both of those mean the same thing. One's a plus and one's a minus. Okay. So for my next one, I'm going to get the y squared isolated. So I'm going to add 16 to both sides. So I'm going to have that y squared is equal to 65 plus 16, which is 81. So then from here, I have to square root both sides. Oops, wrong color. Let's do red here. Let's keep it consistent. So I'm going to square root both sides and not forget my plus or minus. So then I can get that y is equal to plus or minus the square root of 81. So y is equal to plus or minus 9, because 9 times 9 is 81. Or I can say that y is equal to a positive 9 and a negative 9. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have something called the completing the square. So the completing the square is really important. This is going to play a major role, especially if you take Math140, and also towards the end of this class, once we get into, our circles and the ellipses and the hyperbolas. So here we have the ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So this is my general equation. So if I were to have my general equation, here are some steps that I would use in order to complete the completing the square. I would make sure that the leading coefficient is 1. So that means my a value would be equal to 1. I would rewrite the equation with a constant isolated on the right side of the equation. Then I would identify three different things, the b divided by 2, and the b divided by 2 squared. Then I kind of follow that outline. And of course that c, that sign is going to depend on the original problem. Actually, all the signs are going to depend on the original problem. Then I use the square root property to cancel out the degree 2. Then I solve for the variable, and then I check my solution in the original equation. So that's a lot of steps, but let's see if we can make out with it. So for example number 1, it says consider the equation x squared plus 8x minus 4 is equal to 0. So I'm like, okay, so that's my general equation. I definitely have that my a is equal to 1. That's here. That's the leading coefficient, so I'm okay. So step number 1, I'm good. Now I want to make sure that the constant is isolated on the right side of the equation. So the constant here is 4, or negative 4. So the opposite of subtraction is addition. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So really what I have now is an x squared plus 8x is equal to a positive 4. So now for step 3, it says identify my b divided by 2, and b divided by 2 squared. So here the b value is the thing in front of the x. So I'm going to have that my b is equal to 8. Okay. The next thing that I want is the b divided by 2. So what would be 8 divided by 2? That would be 4. And the last thing is that b divided by 2 squared. So 4 squared is 16. So now I have all of my pieces of information, and now I'm going to follow that outline. So remember that general outline, I have that x plus my b divided by 2 squared is equal to that constant, which is 4 because I moved it, plus my b divided by 2 squared. So, okay, now I'm going to plug in what I have. So I'm going to have my x plus squared is equal to 4 plus. So that b divided by 2 value, I said that was a 4. And I also have my b divided by 2 squared, which was my 16. So I really have that this is x plus 4 squared is equal to, and 4 plus 16 is 20. Now I just solve for the x. So I am going to square root both sides to get rid of that square. So I have x plus 4 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 20. And then I will subtract 4 from both sides. So I can get that x is equal to a negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 20. And the square root of 20, that can be simplified even further. So I would have negative 4 plus or minus, and the square root of 20, that simplifies to 2 square root 5. And so that's going to be my final answer. So this is your first introduction to completing the square. And remember, it's all about following that formula and identifying your b, what would that b be like if you divide it by 2 and then squaring it. So here's a second example. So I have x squared plus 9x plus 8 is equal to 0. So again, my leading coefficient here is 1, so that's good. So now I want to isolate the constant, so I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. So now I have x squared plus 9x is equal to a negative 8. And I can see my b value here is equal to 9. So b is equal to 9. So my b divided by 2 just be a 9/2. Keep it as a fraction, okay? So if I were to square that 9/2, well, 9 times 9 is 81, and 2 times 2 is 4. So b divided by 2 squared is just 9/2 squares. So now I'm going to plug it into that formula. So I'm going to have x plus my b divided by 2 squared is equal to a negative 8 plus my b divided by 2 squared. So here my b divided by 2 is a 9/2. So I'm going to keep it as a 9/2. And that b divided by 2 squared is my 81 over 4. So now I'm going to have this as x plus my 9/2 squared is equal to, now I'm going to plug this into my calculator, negative 8 plus the fraction of 81 divided by 4. Now I'm going to get my 49 over 4. From here, I get to square root both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. So I'm going to get that x plus my 9/2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 49 over 4. And I kind of ran out of room, so I'm just going to move it over here. So from here, I'm just going to rewrite it. So x plus 9/2 is equal to plus or minus, and I can rewrite it as 49 square root over the square root of 4. So x plus my 9/2 is equal to plus or minus, the square root of 49 is 7, and the square root of 4 is 2. So x is equal to a negative 9/2 plus or minus my 7/2. So this is where I'm going to have two answers, where x is equal to a negative 9/2 plus 7/2. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on my calculator. So I have a negative 9/2 plus my 7/2. That's going to give me a -1 as my final answer. Now I'm also going to have my second answer, which is x is equal to a negative 9/2 minus 7/2. So I'm going to plug that into my calculator. So negative 9/2 minus 7/2. And I get x is equal to a -8. So that's going to be my answer for example number 2. I get -1 and -8 as my final answer. Okay, well, I hope that helps. And the third example is slightly different. And to make sure that I have enough room, I'm going to go ahead and start on the left-hand side. So I have a negative 3x squared plus 3x is equal to a negative 18. What's different about this one is that that leading coefficient is not 1. So my a value is equal to negative 3. That's not good. So I have to be careful. I need it to be a 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it out. So divide by negative 3. Divide by negative 3. Divide by negative 3. So each thing gets divided by negative 3. So I'm going to have an x squared minus 1x is equal to, and a negative 18 divided by a negative 3 is a positive 6. So now I can tell you that my b value is -1. I can tell you that when I divide it by 2, I'll get a -1/2. So that means when I square it, I'll get a +1/4. So now I have all my pieces together. So now I'm going to rewrite that formula. So x minus, you know what, I'll go ahead and put a plus. B divided by 2 squared is equal to 6 plus my b divided by 2 squared. So here, my b divided by 2, that's going to give me a -1/2. And my b divided by 2 squared, that was the +1/4. So I'm going to get x minus 1/2 squared. 6 plus 1/4 is equal to 25/4. So to get rid of that square, I can square root both sides. So now I'll get x minus a 1/2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 25/4. So x minus 1/2 is equal to plus or minus, well, the square root of 25 is 5. The square root of 4 is 4. Now I'm going to add the 1/2 to the opposite side. So x is equal to 1/2 plus or minus 5/4. So again, I'm going to have two different answers here. So for my first answer, I'm going to have x is equal to a 1/2 plus 5/4. So if you can use your calculator so that you have 1/2 plus your fraction of 5/4. That's going to give you a 7/4. So that's going to be your first answer. Now for your second answer, you're going to do the subtraction. So x is equal to a 1/2 minus my 5/4. So I'm going to get that x is equal to a -3/4. Okay, so that is how you do the completing the square. So the next set of problems are practice problems. So this is where you're going to try to figure these out, okay? So I'm going to give you time. So on your, whatever you're watching, your phone, your iPad, your computer, go ahead and press pause. That way you can work out these problems. All right, press pause. Okay, so hopefully you've had enough time to work out these problems. So for the first practice problem, I got x is equal to -3 and x is equal to -5. For the second practice problem, I got x is equal to 6 and x is equal to 4. For number 3, I have that the leading coefficient is not 1. So therefore, I had to divide everything by 2 first. So I'm going to get that x is equal to 1/2 and x is equal to -1. And that's it. That is the end of section 10.1. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you.